Lightbearer, The Crimson Chronicle, Part 1. Written by J.A. Hawk. Read for you by Joshua Garner.
Chapter 6. Crossroads. Morning dawned as most mornings do. There was a crisp breeze that came from the south. A soft, scuffling sound came from around the pit where the ashy remains of the fire now slumbered. Fletch bent low over the coals and blew softly on them, tickling the reluctant beast from slumber with a few small twigs arranged on top. Eventually, the sluggish flames rose and licked hungrily at the fresh wood. Fletch gave the fire more fuel until it could hold its own against the wind. The fox started to hum loudly to himself, not bothered to keep his voice down. It was a jaunty tune despite the lack of proper lyrics. Fate's head appeared from behind a wall of blankets, and she stared bleary daggers at the noisy troubadour. Fletch, noticing her awake, came close, and she gave an impassioned growl Edek would have been envious of. "Good morning to you as well," Fletch replied as he stooped down and reached a paw into her pack. He fumbled around blindly inside for something, and by way jostled Fate's head as he dug within the makeshift pillow. "Oh, get off!" Fate spat and pushed the pack towards him. She sat up, wrapped her blanket tight about herself, and scooched closer to the fire, which gave off its meager warmth. "I want to," she said grumpily, and stared blankly into the flickering heart of the flames. From Fate's pack, Fletch removed a bronze bowl and a cluster of strange-looking plants. Their leaves were a dry sage color, and each had a bulbous, withered nut that hung from their stems. Fletch poured a measure of water from his water skin into the bowl and sat it in the heart of the fire to boil. Then he took 2 wooden bowls stacked within one another from the pack, separated them, and placed the strange herb with the nuts into each. The water was soon writhing in the small bronze kettle, and Fletch carefully wrapped his paw in a bit of his long sleeve to fish it out. He squawked slightly as he poured the piping hot water into each wooden bowl. A pungent aroma soon filled the air of the small enclosed camp. Fate breathed deeply of the scent, then scratched vivaciously at the back of her head, ran her fingers up through her long ears, and ended with a stretch above her head as far as she could reach. Fletch handed one of the wooden bowls to her. "Thanks," Fate said in a much more pleasant voice than her previously aimed spite. She sipped carefully at the hot tea steeped in the herb. "Any other luck this morning?" "Hardtack," Fletch said as he placed the other bowl in front of Prince Felix. "Gross," Fate replied. For the first time, she noticed that the prince was also awake, but as of yet had stayed silent, and was watching each of them wanly. Fate cradled her bowl close with both paws. "So this is a bribe, huh?" "Yeah, sorry." Fletch tossed a few of the biscuit wafers which had been warming on a rock next to the fire at Fate, which landed in her lap. To Prince Felix he gave some as well. Fate picked up one of the wafers and bit into it. The biscuit had a fibrous consistency, and to her disappointment, her memory of just how awful the things actually tasted was still fairly accurate. She chewed and chewed, but the blasted wafers never seemed to get any easier to swallow. Finally, with great effort, she forced herself to swallow the pasty substance and nearly choked. Fate coughed and brought the bowl of hot tea up to her lips and drank carefully. The tea was much better than the hardtack, despite the fact that it was somewhat bitter. Within the tea, the withered nut had now rehydrated itself in the hot water. Fate drank another mouthful, this time thankfully unadulterated by the taste of the wafer. The tea was strong and it cleared her senses with a spicy aroma. It also left a tingling sensation that lingered in her mouth. The next few minutes were spent trying to see how little she actually had to chew the hardtack before she could force the sorry excuse for breakfast down. For some inexplicable reason, chewing only seemed to make the dreadful stuff expand, making it an even more unbearable task. "So, how are you feeling?" Fate asked Prince Felix once she had given up on the hardtack exercise of eating. Better, Felix replied. Despite whatever this stuff is. He looked sourly at his last bite of hardtack. I know what you mean, Fate said mournfully. She took the 2 nuts from her nearly empty bowl of tea and popped them into her mouth. A small shiver of enjoyment ran through her as the zesty flavor assaulted her senses with wonderful clarity. Fate noticed the prince watching her. They're good. You should try one. No. I've had enough adventure for one morning, I think. Prince Felix leaned forward and extended the tea bowl towards Fate, with a solitary nut still untouched at the bottom. She smiled and reached out to take the unwanted prize, but Fletch was too fast for her. In one quick motion, the fox swooped out of nowhere, scooped up the bowl from Prince Felix, and had popped the plump nut into his own mouth. Then he stooped, picked up Fate's empty bowl, and was gone. In a flash, Fletch had both of the bowls washed with a bit of water, stacked together along with the bronze bowl, and stowed properly back into the luggage. Fate was a little stunned and disappointed, but she shook it off and stood up slowly. She began to help Fletch break down camp wherever she could. But when Prince Felix started to get to his feet, she stopped and watched with concern. The prince was slow getting up, and tested out each of his legs with a wary caution. Once they had proved decently strong, he began to stretch laboriously with many a groan. After watching for a moment, Fate assumed the prince only suffered from a stiffness, as he seemed to become much more nimble the longer he moved about. I believe, Prince Felix said, stamping his foot a few times, I could travel without the litter today. My paw still hurts when I try to move it, but my legs feel totally fine. Good, Fletch said, relieved. Edek will become a nightmare if he has to keep dragging you around. What's that now? The prince asked with a very confused look. I don't understand. Is the brute not trained properly? Fletch stopped in his tracks and laughed outright, which made the prince look even more dumbstruck. Drakes are, well... Fate started to explain, but faltered while looking for the right word. Difficult, Fletch supplied, trying to stymie his laughter. Fate cracked a smile. Unique, she said finally. If humored, they are nice enough, but very proud. Also, you should not talk as such. They are not beast. Nor are they above such things as petty revenge for discourtesy, Fletch said as he moved to dismember the litter. He cast a sly glance at Fate. Do you remember when he stole Sunder from Master Silver and lodged it through that tree? How could I forget? Fate laughed slightly. He had to cut the whole thing down to get it out. You know, for him to not have wings, Fletch mused as he cut one of the saplings free from the litter's lashing with his knife. I still really don't know how he got that thing stuck up that high. Fate and Fletch both laughed again. Prince Felix smiled at the humors, but also looked somewhat alienated by the close camaraderie of the other two, in which he was an outsider. Once the mirth had subsided, Fletch looked very close at Prince Felix, measuring him up. Then he placed one foot on the sapling and broke it to size. Here, use this. Fletch tossed the walking stick towards the prince, who caught it with his good paw. Where is he, anyway? Fate asked cheerily. Pfft, Fletch made a noise with his mouth. He'll catch us up. Been trying to give him the slip for years and still not managed it. Fletch kicked dirt onto the fire and stamped heartily until the flames and coals were completely extinct. Then each of them gathered their scattered belongings, rolled their blankets tight, and hefted packs onto their backs. At first they went slowly, allowing Prince Felix to set the pace as they traveled out of the small dell and into the east once again. Fog and mist hung heavy on the rolling hills, giving all the land an eerie look. The feeling of the unknown lurking just beyond sight. Not until the sun rose high into the sky did it finally vanish. Not long into their trek, Edek could be seen following them. He moved quickly through the hills, with his head held low following their scent. His serpentine body looked somewhat sinister as it appeared upon the crest of a hill, only to vanish again like a great sea serpent flowing over the contours of the land. Once Edek had joined them, he eyed all with an imperious look. "Sparkroot," Edek said shortly. Sorry," Fletch replied. He moved slightly farther away from Edek, in case any vindictiveness was forthcoming from the drake. "You weren't exactly around." Edek glared a little, but fell into step with them without a word. Now they were all accounted for. They picked up the pace, but walked in silence for the most part, as the quiet of the lonely countryside seemed unwilling to suffer conversation for long. The cruel wind came strong out of the south, but little else was to be marked as they went along. As the miles wore away, Fate noticed Prince Felix had the look of a troubled soul, a mind weighed down by too many questions, and it was not long before he voiced some of what worried him. "I have a question," Prince Felix began slowly. "How did you find me exactly?" "Well, we didn't expect to find you, or anything for that matter," Fletch stated. He rubbed the back of his neck. "The Lightkeepers sent orders down. They came to us. We investigated. When we found an unusual ripple of a technique, we followed it, and eventually it led to you." The prince frowned in deep contemplation as he picked his way along with the help of his walking stick. "Can we ask you a question in return?" Fate asked sincerely. "All right," Prince Felix said hesitantly. "Initiates are supposed to train at the temple in Yonder," Fate said thoughtfully. "I would have thought you'd be more familiar with the Lightkeeper's methods. Did they not take special interest in your training? Not only considering your attachment to the capital for one, but secondly, the Crimson Catalyst is unique. At least it's supposed to be unique if books, elders, and even Edek here are to be believed." "Well, is it?" Prince Felix asked in a brisk tone. "As special as he claims?" Edek turned his massive head to look back at the prince. The drake's unblinking stare assaulted the rabbit for a long moment, his head locked on with predatory focus. Then, without a word, he returned his attention back to the trail. Fate looked worriedly at Edek for a second, then turned to the prince. Most of the time we take that to mean yes," she said nervously. In an undertone she added, "Drakes rarely utter falsehoods." "Right. Well, to answer your question," Prince Felix began, "I wasn't at the temple very long. There was a ceremony held at Arbor Keep, and I left for Heldor right after. Almost as soon as I arrived, a message of state came to me from my father." Prince Felix recounted his time spent with Captain Waddle as they made their way across the eastern countryside, their brief stop at the capital, and then their departure towards the rendezvous location of the treaty. He explained details large and small until his story came to the part where Wrath and his band of wolves had attacked and murdered his company upon the meadow. It was then he stopped and became introspective and quiet. "We were ambushed. I got away and fled into the forest." Felix ended his tale abruptly. Fate got the impression that the prince didn't quite trust them far enough to elaborate on the reasons behind the attacks. Perhaps one day he would be willing to open up about the topic again, but she didn't think now was the time to press the matter, and she had other queries. "You used a technique during that attack, didn't you?" Fate asked. Yes, it's how I got away," Prince Felix said. He looked down at his bandaged paw. "Do you remember what it was?" Fate asked, prodding for details. Prince Felix's brows furrowed in concentration. "I'm not sure," Prince Felix said lamely. "It was more like a reaction, or as if I really didn't have a say in what was happening. But it was enough to hide me, give me enough time to get away from the battle and escape into the woods." Was it some sort of Dwemer technique? Fate asked. I didn't even think such things were possible. No. Or maybe yes? Something along those lines, perhaps. I was only thinking about escaping, Prince Felix explained. Fletch whistled loudly in a gesture of disbelief at the prince's words. And you can't remember anything of what went into that technique? Fate asked, aghast. You really didn't have time to learn much, did you? Noctoral, Fletch said to the air. Edek gave a rasping, guttural sound in reply, a halting sort of growl. Fate closed the distance on Fletch and punched him hard in the arm. That wasn't kind, she admonished sternly. Fletch gave a yelp of pain and grabbed his arm. Edek's rasping noise stopped. What did he say? Prince Felix said, annoyed. Noctoral. It means small light, Fate said as she fell back to her place in line. It's what they call new recruits, the ones that can't control the light properly yet. It's a bit of a rite of passage. Nobody ever said that to me, Felix said, looking at Fate confused. Well, you are a prince, she said in a quiet voice. You were probably above some of the hazing. And do you believe that? Prince Felix asked. That I'm noctoral? Well, it is traditional, Fate admitted with a guilty grimace. I see. Prince Felix fell quiet for a while, looking hurt and alienated. Fate noticed and tried to change the subject. Anyway, she began slowly, you're lucky nothing worse happened to you. When you draw upon the light, if your intent isn't clear, any number of unexpected things can happen. The more sophisticated your intent, say by confining it with a word, Fate then drew upon the light and performed a technique. Iyun, she spoke the keeper's tongue. The lithium crystal on her paw glinted, and the air about her seemed to shimmer. Well, you get the picture. Fate stepped forward from a cloud of mist that had formed, and she let the technique fade. It takes practice, knowledge, focus, and no small amount of your own strength. And what about this? Prince Felix asked, holding up his injured paw, indicating the crimson catalyst. Can you teach me about it? No, Fate said simply. Why not? Prince Felix asked. Is this another traditional thing? It's nothing like that. I don't know myself, Fate said calmly. I believe Edek when he says that it's unique. They never taught Fletch or I anything about the ring outside of its existence. Perhaps this is something for you alone to understand as its bearer. We need to hurry, Fletch interjected seriously. The fox had stopped at the crest of a hill and was looking towards the south intently. His ear twitched slightly. I can feel the pressure changing. A storm will be upon us soon. Indeed, dark clouds were looming up in the south around the base of the mountains far in the distance. From that point on, Fletch set a very rapid pace, urging the company along with dire intent. They traveled hastily through the rolling hills, which eventually gave way to flatter plains, with little to be seen in any direction. Despite the land passing by in great swaths of green and brown, Fate happened upon a small patch of wild onions. She stopped and waved the rest of them to carry on. Fate picked as many of the reddish bulbs as she could carry, and then running swiftly caught up to the rest. Her long legs made short work of the difference on the flat terrain. When she eventually caught up with the rest, she was breathing hard, but passed a fat, ripe onion to each of them. The food helped cull the pathetic rations they had endured today, but Fletch did not let the pace slow. Dark, billowing clouds were forming behind them, and followed with a rapid ferocity, building ever larger and more ominous as the evening began to set in. It won't be long now, Fletch called as he flipped his pack around and dug inside for something. He had brought the group up to a quick trot and had not relented for some time now. We need to find something quick. With difficulty, he pulled out a cloak of oiled fabric from his pack. Fate, seeing this, understood what Fletch was planning and unslung her longbow from her back. She stopped briefly to unstring the weapon with the use of her legs, then stored the catgut string in a pouch at her belt. Once she had caught up to Fletch, she gave Ivy over to him. Fletch awkwardly took his own sword from his waist as he trotted along, then carefully wrapped both weapons tightly in the oiled fabric. "Over there," Fate called, pointing north. A solitary form of a tree could be seen in the distance. The wind harrowed after them in a wicked wheel, and the billowing black clouds formed an angry beast in which forked lightning fueled its oncoming wrath. There was nothing else for it, and so they made for the tree at a dead sprint. The tree was smaller than expected and had been long dead. It was mangled on one side and looked like it had been struck by lightning at least once, if not more. The damaged side of the tree revealed it was slightly hollow, but nowhere near large enough to shelter in. Fletch, who had reached the tree first, quickly stowed Fate's longbow and his own sword inside. Then he tossed his pack in. Fate came up with Prince Felix, who limped slightly and was holding a stitch in his side. A painful grimace was etched upon his face. Fate stripped off her own pack and dug inside hastily. Bowls clattered and herbs rustled as she quickly retrieved her own oiled fabric from the very bottom of the bag. Fletch quickly stuffed Fate's pack roughly inside the now packed tree, then sat down with his back to the gap sheltering the gear. Fate joined Fletch and motioned Prince Felix over. She cast her cloak high into the air and draped it over all three of their heads, just as the storm wall caught them. The vanguard of the storm hit like a hammer upon an anvil. The wind howled and the rain came down in freezing sheets. The oiled cloak might have been big enough to cover two completely, but was somewhat insufficient for three. Cold water splashed up their feet and legs, begriming them all in dark, sticky mud. Slowly, they all became very damp, and cold crept into their very bones. Tightly they huddled together, sharing what little warmth each of them still had. Blue streaks of lightning raced across the sky, and a peal of thunder cracked directly overhead. They all jumped involuntarily as they felt the pressure wave of the thunder wash over them like the breath of a giant beast searching out prey. The wind whipped and swelled at the edges of the cloak, sending icy blasts of cold water into their faces. Through the commotion of the storm, Fate sensed something moving close by, and suddenly the wind seemed to calm a bit. It no longer howled as viciously as before, and the air became slightly warmer. She peeked out from underneath the cloak and saw that Edek had curled his great elongated form around the entirety of the hollow tree, and the three of them forming a wind buffer. Gratefully, Fate extended a paw out and touched Edek gently on the side. The drake's great eye looked at her for a heartbeat, then slowly closed as he laid his head down in quiet defiance of the raging storm. The rain tinkled as it pounded hard upon his scales, and with that strange music in their ears, they drifted into an uneasy sleep. Prince Felix awoke very late. The storm had mercifully stopped, and night was in full bloom. He had found it hard to fall asleep. The noise of the storm in his busy mind had kept him awake long after he had heard the deep breathing of the other two. Felix kept running the last 2 days over in his head, but any time before that was a frustrating difficulty. If fate was to be believed, it had been the better part of 5 years since he had escaped into that dreadful darkness called Wellborough. But he couldn't remember clearly what exactly had happened once he had. There was only an inescapable feeling of longing that seemed to permeate the memory of his time there. Once he'd woken up on the litter in present company, necessity had forced him to go with them. But now he felt fit enough and saw a chance to take matters back into his own will. Slowly and carefully he got to his feet, not wanting to wake the other two, and extricated himself from the huddle. He looked down at the fox and the hare. Fletch had taken most of the oiled fabric, and it was twisted tightly around his body. Fate was tucked tight against him in a ball, with her head laying upon his arm. These two were fine enough folk, he decided, but Felix had made up his mind as the storm raged endlessly. If they were as close to the Great Western Road as the fox had believed, Felix needed only to head north, and he would hit it sooner or later. From there, he could make his way towards the capital. The prince crept slowly away from the huddle, taking extra caution not to disturb the other two in any way, and made his way up an embankment. Felix was nearly out of earshot when a low voice confronted him.
"Where are you going?"
A boulder unfurled itself into the form of Edek, and the drake padded heavily over to the prince. Felix had completely forgotten about the brute. Ruffled, he quickly racked his brain for any excuse. "I needed to make water," Prince Felix said. A plausible enough excuse. It had been a few hours after all, but Edek stopped in front of the prince, towering above him like a great, scaly gargoyle. Without warning, the drake reached out a claw, hooked it behind the prince's foot, and pulled hard. Prince Felix fell and slammed into the cold, wet ground. The huge, clawed foot of Edek descended down upon his chest and pinned him securely to the ground.
"You lie,"
Edek growled. Prince Felix struggled against the great paw holding him flat, but in vain. "Get off!" Prince Felix demanded.
"No,"
Edek rumbled. "Okay, look," Prince Felix pleaded, throwing caution to the wind. "I have to go north."
"No,"
Edek rumbled even lower.
"They risked much by helping you. You go east."
"I am a prince," Felix argued vainly, but his words were cut short as Edek's claws constricted and the pressure on his chest increased painfully.
"Arrogant, ungrateful."
The great head of Edek lowered closely to Felix's face.
"You are not but a rabbit,"
he hissed menacingly. Edek's long teeth were so very close to Felix, and the smell of carrion was overpoweringly strong. The prince began to shake uncontrollably. A fear he had never felt before flooded through him at the realization that this creature could easily rip him in twain if he had half the mind to. Tears pooled in the corner of his eyes, and to his shame his finer controls left him. "East," Felix stammered, nodding his head in vigorous affirmation. "I promise I'll go east with them." He winced painfully as he struggled to breathe. Edek growled once more, then finally the pressure lessened upon the prince's chest. The drake looked down imperiously, then suddenly he snorted and gave the prince a disgusted look.
"Pathetic,"
he muttered as he took his foot away. He shook his paw as if he had stepped in something filthy and moved away with heavy footfalls. An overwhelming feeling of shame flooded through Felix. The cold water at his back had gone slightly warm. He took several deep breaths to compose himself. Once he had mastered his shock, Felix wiped his nose and eyes on the back of his paws and got to his feet. He looked around and saw a standing puddle left by the great deluge from earlier. He went to it and cleaned his fur the best he could. Edek had reformed himself back into a dark, silent mound somewhere out of sight. When Felix finished cleaning himself, he found that he was still caked in vile, sticky mud. With a sigh, he headed back towards the dead tree, where Fate and Fletch still slept on undisturbed. Felix looked down at them for a moment, then slowly he maneuvered himself next to Fate. Felix yanked a portion of the oiled cloth away from Fletch, who sleepily muttered something incoherent, then tucked himself in close to the warmth of the others. The prince closed his eyes, trying to forget the fear that had overwhelmed him, and willed sleep to take him instead. Morning dawned, cold and wet. The sky was an overcast pale gray. They woke to find it had begun to rain again, a misty, light rain that swirled and blew annoyingly into their eyes. With slight difficulty, each untangled themselves from the other. Fate thought they all looked as miserable as she felt. Seeing the group stir, Edek now came over. He watched as they slowly stretched aching limbs and beat life back into stiff feet, all victims of the poor conditions in which they had been forced to bed. The Drake kept a dark eye on Prince Felix, but as was his way, said nothing and waited patiently. There was no food left to be had, and it seemed that Edek had not found anything worth sharing during the night either. With grim faces, they tightened their belts, removed their packs and weapons from the dead tree, and made slow progress away from their forced camp. "We came rather far yesterday," Fletch announced to the others. "We should be close to the Crossroads and Middlestone. You see that rise in the distance?" He motioned to the misty horizon north and east. "We can get a bit of an overlook there and see what's due." Then he plodded off with less than his usual spunk. Fate felt terrible and could not bring herself to even reply. Instead, she busied herself removing ivy from the oiled cloak and tied it to her pack. Archery was well out of the question. Somehow, during the torrential downpour, the rain had found its way to her stowed bowstring, and it was ruined beyond use. Fate had fared little better during the night and was hardly recognizable. Caked thoroughly with mud as she was, her once white fur was nearly brown as tree bark now. This realization did nothing to improve her mood, and dismally she shoved the oiled cloak into Prince Felix's arms and headed after Fletch on tired feet. It took the better part of an hour for them to traverse to the place Fletch had intended. A small cropping of trees swelled up in a tight cluster and created a small overlook into a valley. As they approached the overlook, Fletch crouched low and slowly crawled his way up to peer over. Fate followed him stealthily, making sure to take both of her long, not-so-white ears in her paw and pulled them down close to her neck as to not draw any attention when she neared the top of the hill. Fletch glanced back down the hill and gave a small signal beckoning the prince to join them. Felix imitated Fate and crawled to the top of the small hill, taking care that his ears did not crest over the edge. Edek, unbothered by this sudden act of espionage, did not climb the hill, but crouched low at the base of the overlook and busied himself cleaning mud from one of his large claws. From their vantage, there was a clear view of the valley. The great western road cut through the countryside below, and not far off it connected with the crossroads. From that point, a great road branched off towards the north, well worn and beaten flat by the countless feet of travelers. To the east, from the crossroads, the path wended its way through sporadic trees and off towards a decent-sized village, that of Middlestone. On clear days, the town could be viewed from this far out. However, today was not one of those days, and it existed only as an imagined fancy through the haze. Fate shimmied up closer towards Fletch to get a better look, when she stopped and leaned close to him, sniffing lightly. "Ugh, you stink," she said, recoiling. "You're no daisy either," Fletch replied, not taking his eyes off the crossroads. Fate's mouth fell open, slightly aghast. Her shock took the better part of a moment to wear off. Then she slowly closed her mouth and turned her attention towards what the valley had to tell. Down below at the conjecture of the two great roads, a large carriage was stopped. The sluggish commotion of sleepy inhabitants could be seen moving around it. Clearly the carriage had benighted here at the crossroads and had yet to break camp. "There's a pride lancer," Fletch said slowly. A few paces from the carriage, a great tawny lion was stabled in a makeshift stall, covered over with a rough canvas. "We're lucky. This rain probably kept him from patrolling, otherwise we could have run right into him." Fate looked at the great cat yawning widely underneath its shelter. That meant a royal knight was down there. Fate cast a wary look at Prince Felix, who had the unmistakable look of longing etched upon his face. If he decided to break cover, there would be nothing she or Fletch could do to stop his inevitable escort back to the capital. The prince looked very tense, and then a change came over him. Perhaps something inside of him balked, or perhaps better sense won over, because he did not give them away. Instead, he took his eyes from the crossroads and frowned disappointedly as he turned his back to the caravan. Fate released a slow breath of relief, which caught in her throat when something at the crossroads caught her eye. "Outcaster," she hissed. A tall figure in a long black coat of fine leather had just moved from behind the carriage. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking the fine sash of crimson red that stood out clearly from underneath the outcaster's dark coat. "Do we know him?" Fletch asked in a dark tone. "No, I've never seen them before," Fate said seriously. Fletch was thoughtful for a moment. "Looks like your brother finally got fed up with Brightfur," he said to Felix. "Who's that?" Felix asked. "Thief, outlaw, enjoys nicking stuff from royal convoys in the eastern reaches," Fletch said as he slid slowly back down the hill. "Come on, we can skirt wide and make for the town from the south. I'd rather not tangle with those lads." Fate and Felix followed Fletch down the incline. Fletch quickly relayed what they had seen to Adek. Then he took a southern trajectory which would pull them well away from the road. The misty rain and haze found their chosen path agreeable, and so traveled with them, which created a natural guise from unfriendly eyes. An hour passed, or perhaps 2, when Fletch finally stopped. "Edek, I think there's a bridge on the east side of town," he said, waving a paw vaguely towards the distant fog. "You shouldn't have trouble picking out where."
"Fine. I'll find it,"
Edek replied. The drake moved to leave, but paused as he passed Prince Felix. Edek looked pointedly at the rabbit for a long moment, then moved away and was swallowed quickly by the thick mist. "What was that about?" Fate asked once the drake was out of earshot. "I don't know," Fletch said slowly. He cast a side-eyed look at the prince. Fletch did not disclose any suspicions he might have had, but instead he walked slowly into the mist and Fate followed. Very suddenly, the form of a building loomed up out of nothing from the heart of the fog, and before long they were surrounded by many small buildings. Indeed, they had made their way into the small town of Middlestone. Fletch navigated the tight streets with apparent ease despite the poor visibility, and subsequently brought them to a large, long, 2-storied building. Fate looked up at the sign, which read, "The Whistling Wolf." There was an ironwork depiction of a wolf biting down upon the neck of a fiddle. Fletch pulled the iron-wrought handle of the door, and warmth and light flooded into the misty street, beating back the dreary effect of the weather. "Now that's the ticket," Fletch said as he quickly passed over the threshold. Fate, likewise, was keen for the warm light, but stopped on the verge of entering and looked back. Prince Felix was standing stock still and shivering visibly in the middle of the road. He rubbed his arms as if he had goose flesh and looked around, peering into the obscured streets with a wild eye. "Hey, what's up?" Fate asked. "It's nothing, maybe," Felix said. "But I've the most uncanny feeling malicious eyes were upon us." The prince shook himself and moved quickly past Fate inside, but she noticed the hair on the back of his neck was still raised in alarm. Fate took a long look into the obscuring fog, which swirled gently at the edges of sight. Phantoms might be able to see through this haze, but she certainly couldn't. Fate turned her back to the street and went inside quickly. The door closed behind her with a sharp snap. The sign of the Whistling Wolf creaked noisily in the cold breeze.
Thank you for listening to this audio recording of Lightbearer by J.A. Hawk. If you enjoyed this production, consider supporting the author's work. Your support goes a long way in helping independent artists with projects like this one. Paperback copies of Lightbearer are now available for purchase through Amazon.com. And for readers who prefer a hardback version, they may be purchased through BarnesandNoble.com. Follow the links below or scan the QR code to pick up your copy of Lightbearer today.